And it just also just gives us positive things, right? Like so often we think of self-control of like, damn it, I broke my diet, I'm ashamed of myself, or I'm angry with myself, or I was lazy. And just think of it as like building a positive skill, right?
Welcome to Stoic Conversations. My name is Caleb Ontiveros.
And I'm Michael Tremblay.
And today we're going to be talking about moderation, one of the cardinal virtues. It's an essential one, of course, difficult to train. And we'll be talking about what it is for the Stoics and be going into detail by talking about some of its subcomponents. So this is going to be similar to an earlier episode we have on courage, where we break down what some of the ancient Stoics said about the parts of a virtue, because I think that's a useful way both to get a sense of what the Stoics meant when they were talking about that core cardinal virtue, but also its different aspects and how it shows up in ordinary life.
Yeah, I find these really helpful. It's a nice way to apply, to be practical, because you can be practical about specific examples, like what should I do in in a specific kind of situation. But I like this idea of really deep diving into the virtues, because it says outside of any kind of situation, what is the way a good person tends to act? But we still get the level of specificity. We still get the kind of qualities that you try to build and cultivate. I really enjoyed our courage conversation. Looking forward to this one.
Yep, absolutely. So we're going to be talking about moderation, and we'll go through what it is for the Stoics. We talk about a few different examples and then dive into those subcomponents of moderation. So the first thing to say about this virtue is that I think it's one of the probably one of the key ones that's associated with Stoicism. This, training one's mind, having a sense of self mastery, being disciplined. There's that maxim from Publius Cyrus: would you have a great empire, rule over yourself, which captures that call from Stoicism to be moderate, to be a master of one's desires and aversions. And what that looks like philosophically for the Stoics is knowing the correct amount of things. Each of the virtues are defined by knowledge. So courage was knowing what to pursue, what to avoid. And whereas moderation, that's knowing the right amount of things. So then we have these associated ideas of discipline, self-restraint, and self-control. And the way it described in Aristodemus's epitome of Stoic ethics is the domain of self-restraint that deals with man's impulses. So that's that idea of self-mastery. We're getting impressions. We have these impulses and urges to act in specific ways, but where moderation is knowing sort of which of those to act on, and especially knowing the right amount of perhaps a given behavior, not too much, not too little.
Yeah, well, I like this idea of self-mastery, self-control, because it reminds me of our discussion of courage. You can think of courage as like moderating. I shouldn't say moderating, but dealing with your impulses as they relate to external things. The tiger jumps out, and do you run away or do you confront it? Somebody threatens you. Are you fearful or are you brave? It's about how do you respond to this kind of external stimulus, and then you maybe one way to think about moderation would be, well, how do you respond to the internal stimulus, the desire that bubbles up, the desire to do things, to get more, to want more, and knowing when to draw that line. And so I guess there's knowing how to control that internal state. So that kind of self-restraint, which is like literally restraining, pulling back. And then maybe there's that aspect of self-mastery, which is like, well, I don't actually have to restrain anything because there's nothing left to restrain. There's no longer any desire. But either way, it's dealing with that internal, that inside, as opposed to courage, which is dealing with that outside.
Yep. Yeah, I think that's a useful way to think about things. Another useful framing, of course, comes from Aristotle. If you're thinking about moderation, you can think about moderation as the mean between sort of that lack of self restraint versus asceticism, something that just doesn't experience, doesn't act on that impulse at all, even when it'd be appropriate to do so. So, and you can see that in action. One of the Stoics' favorite examples, especially Epictetus. Epictetus talks about, living as if you were at a banquet and enjoying the dishes as they come by without, gorging yourself, without pining after them when they're gone, and so on. And that's, I think, you can see moderation in that context of eating easily enough. You're not called to be an ascetic, someone who doesn't experience the joys of life, but you can't be someone who gorges yourself with them either.
Yeah, it's a great way of putting it. It's like, just because you're a stoic, you don't have to be a grump. You don't have to not have the good things in life. You just have them in the right way at the right time and in the right amount. So you indulge when it's appropriate and you hold back when it's appropriate. And we've talked about this before, but one thing Epictetus really talks about is like when you look at that asceticism, or the kind of person who's says, well, I'm never gonna eat this kind of food, or I'm going to sleep on the floor, or I'm going to endure these difficult things. Just there's a benefit to that kind of training. It can be done in the right way at the right time. I mean, I'm an athlete myself, but there's a kind of immoderation, or there's kind of another desire often that can be fulfilled, namely to be seen by other people, to be a certain kind of way, to be tough, cool, or to see yourself, your own ego, to view yourself as being a certain way. And
Mm-hmm.
neither of those are moderate, right? Both of those are just engaging in a different extreme, right? The extreme, as you said, the extreme of self-denial, that asceticism, versus the extreme of indulgence. In moderation is, no, I'm not going to be extreme. I'm going to be the right amount as needed.
Yeah, yeah. Are there people who come to mind in your life, or maybe even fictional historical examples, who you think are good exemplars of moderation?
I'm not sure. I was going to think of Goggins. Is that he say his name? David Goggins. You know who
Oh
I'm
yeah,
talking
David
about?
Goggins. Yeah.
I was thinking about him as someone who's immoderate. Immoderately, he's a kind of an ultra marathon runner. I think he has the world, or had at one point, the world record for pull-ups. Kind of is like, no pain, no gain taken to the extreme. And maybe that's a better life than being sedentary, never really understanding the limits of your ability, not having tried. Maybe it's better to have done to be like that. But at the end of the day, I see that as somebody where I think, is that the best life? Doesn't strike me as it is. It seems almost immoderate the other way. That's what I was thinking of.
Yeah,
Oh.
that's a good example. Well, so David Goggins, his book, isn't it called like Get Hard or something? Or maybe not. I don't know. Maybe I should.
It's something intense. Never back down. Something like this.
Yeah, his first book, which I read, Can't Hurt Me.
Can't
Can't
hurt
Hurt
me.
Me is what it's called. In his first book, he talks about, which I do enjoy. I enjoyed his first book. I haven't read his second one. He talks about being at a training camp where he's being tested with other men for an elite squad, and one of the things they need to do is like navigate this terrain in a given time period, and he's able to survive, and he's shown in like past tests that he's excellent at enduring, surviving, and so on. But he ends up in the wrong spot, and he's cut because he like messes up some navigation related tasks, which I think is evidence of your view, which is that he's someone who's so good at pushing himself, especially physically, that he potentially overlooked developing some other skills. And it might be, some of these other characters who manage to join these elite teams have a better, you can think of it almost as a kind of moderation, where they have a skill set which is probably not better in every single way than David Goggins, but might be either more suited for a particular role, or is more well-rounded in a physical but also strategic sense.
Yeah, I think that's well put. I mean, the way that I think about this, I do think about it kind of Aristotelian way sometimes, which is to say, if you're having trouble with motivation, if you're feeling lazy, if you're feeling immoderately indulgent, maybe reading David Goggins' book would be really helpful and inspirational. But it's not clear to me that somebody who's already quite tough, quite has good endurance skills, is good at pushing themselves, needs to be pulled more in that direction. It's about kind of finding that equilibrium and finding that balance. So I'm not saying that kind of if you're a fan of David Goggins, there's no value to that. I think there is, and it can be inspiring, but it's always should be, in my view, inspiring by pulling you closer towards the middle. And once you swing past the middle, you've gone too far. And I guess that's the point to say that when you're looking at moderation, you have to be candid in either direction, right? Are you too extreme? Are you too extremely tough? Are you overworking? Are you not balancing out the other parts of your life, or are you not working hard enough? Are you not maximizing your potential? And so it goes both ways, and it can be tempting to view moderation as, well, you shouldn't be eating that, or you shouldn't be relaxing as much, or you shouldn't be you're indulging in kind of physical pleasure. And it's not that. It's just, we talked about this, but it's not just denial of physical goods. That is not the right way to
Hmm.
think about moderation. It is about finding balance, and balance will be different, right? If you decide to be a Navy SEAL, you can be a balanced Navy SEAL, and a balanced Navy SEAL is going to look like somebody who's like very good at marathons and very good at navigating, instead of world class at marathons and terrible at navigating, right? Like, balance is going to look different depending on the role you take on, but it is about that balance. And you can go too far in the pursuit of effort and excellence to become unbalanced. And I think that's a key part of moderation.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that's, it's looking for knowing the right amount of things that involves that skill to identify what, the intensity that that's called for a given situation.
Okay, do you have role models of moderation? I provided a non role model.
Well, so some people that come to mind are, I think, people who have one common trait. I think it's interesting because it's harder to find, I think, examples of moderate people in a way, at least for me, than courageous ones, because you can pick out, that courageous moment that someone showed their skill, whereas the moderate person almost flies under the radar until they make a large mistake, and they realize, oh, maybe they weren't so moderate after all. But something that I've noticed amongst people who I would consider moderate, is the ability to know like what life stage they're in. So people who were dedicated, obsessed with their craft, maybe in their 20s and 30s or something like this, but also knew they wanted to start a family, and that would require not being as obsessed, like, frankly, just not being as good, I think, in some sense, as their craft as other people who would have more of that obsessed trait to them throughout their entire life. So maybe that's one kind of profile that's brought to mind. Maybe some specific people in the startup type space, or even people who are artists of a kind, who move from being someone who creates great works to, as they get older, someone who fosters a scene of other artists around them, and takes on it. They realize as they get older they can take on a different role, what may perhaps one that involves less of the tortured artist making risks all on their own, to being the kind of person who isn't in the spotlight anymore, but supports an ecosystem of other artists. So I think that's those are two,
Yeah.
I guess, two kinds of profiles. Not specific, a few specific people, I guess, fit in that, but that's something I was thinking about.
I mean, I think about that in sport too, like the kind of people who you're kind of aware when your time is up and you're able to really transition gracefully. So in the example of like, I want to raise a family, that's a person making two choices, and maybe those choices are mutually exclusive, but you don't have to start a family. You can continue being grinding in the startup. So you're just making a
Mhm.
choice. And then I think about something like sport, where it's like, your time is up, and not everybody, people kind of can hit a ceiling. And I really respect, there's somebody I know who played professional football for a year. He's a philosophy student. We were in grad school together, and played professional football for a year, and then was kind of like, I'm not good enough at it to like, like I'm pretty good and I was good enough to play professional for a year, but I'm going to kind of pick my battles now. And that's not going to be one that I'm not going to throw my entire life behind this role when there are just
Mhm.
like other ones that I can take on and be happy with. Another example I was thinking of was, we're going to get into what the Stoics have to say about this, but another example of what was people who kind of find that right balance and then just do it for like 60 years. I really admire that, which is maybe the opposite of what I'm saying that before. But like, I think of people like Stephen King or Haruki Murakami, who are two authors, and they're both people that I think like write for 6 hours a day. And then I know Murakami, for example, he writes, he wakes up, he writes for like 6 hours, he goes for a long swim, he like has dinner, and then he goes to bed, and he does that like 6 days a week for the last 35 years. And it's just somebody who like has really found a lifestyle that is productive, and obviously he's like incredibly successful, but is like balanced, sustaining, and fulfillable for him, and it's just kind of like locked in. I think it's a cool kind of life. Obviously, don't force that if you haven't found the right thing. But for people that do, I think, well, that's a really good balance.
Yeah, that's almost. I think it pushes to some extent against this idea of balance in a way where I think there's that. Once made a remark that has stuck with me for some time, pulling out what Epictetus said about cynics. Not everyone is called to be the cynic, but some people are, and you should respect those who are. And perhaps there's an analogy here, which is that some people, because of their talents, situation, interests, are naturally drawn to almost in a way an unbalanced life. But they because of their consistency, the fact that they realize how good they are, they still manage to say avoid a lot of the uh, pitfalls of people who are in a similar situation, but perhaps lose their head because of their ego, because of their success, and
Yeah.
so on. There is a kind of balance in those lives, but there's also, I think, a lot of people, they're closer to the generalist, where in the sense that there's lots of different goods, or maybe one other way to put it is that they have more roles they're playing, and they're not as invested in a single one.
So maybe of the excellent people, or of the people that are drawn to a certain, not everybody's Stephen King or Murakami, but of those, the moderate ones are the ones that kind of take a joy in the craft and find that consistency, and the immoderate ones are the people that have, as you said, the first book blows up and they start partying, and they lose they lose what they loved about writing in the first place. Or I was thinking of the Neil Young line of "It's better to burn out than to fade away," and then I was like, well, moderation and stoicism is not punk in that sense. Moderation is not punk in that it's not burning out, it's not spiraling. There's that kind of degree of consistency, which I admire.
Right, right. Cool. Well, let's get into some of these in these subcomponents. So first, we have a few key sources that break down the virtues into their subcomponents. These people offered, clear lists of the virtues and their parts, which shouldn't be understood as parts literally speaking, but we could say they're the ways their aspects or something of this sort, because the Stoics believed in a way in that the virtues were unified and these were different ways of describing the same kind of skill. But at any rate, we've got two sources, Pseudo Andronicus on the passions, and then Arius Didymus, who I quoted earlier, from the Epitome of Stoic Ethics, which comes to us through another character named Stobaeus or Stobias. And for moderation, Arius Didymus lists 4 aspects, Pseudo Andronicus lists 7. I'll go over the 4 today from Arius Didymus. An interesting character. Perhaps we can go over what we know about him some other time. But he was actually mentor advisor to the first emperor of Rome, Augustus. That's what I'll go over today. Are these 4 aspects. And one other thing I wanted to say about this is that although we don't have lists from Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, some of these other more documented uh, characters. We don't have them breaking down the subcomponents in the same way. We do have them, especially Seneca, referencing similar ideas, both from moderation and from the other virtues, and referencing these, what would be these subcomponents, even if they don't break things down in the same list to like fashion, same taxonomy, which does suggest that there was a tradition, like common tradition within Stoicism for thinking about the virtues and their different aspects. So an example of that is from Aristodemus. He breaks down moderation into good discipline, seemliness, modesty, and self-control. And Seneca has a number of lines where he focuses on orderliness, which is another, I think, another reading of good discipline. Another common translation of good discipline is orderliness, moderation, and seemliness. So that's just one example where you see that that's that tradition, even if it's not explicit. I should say, because we've asked for more citations, the what I'm thinking about is Moral Letters 92 from Seneca, and he says, "What is a happy life? Peacefulness and constant tranquility. Loftiness of mind will bestow this, and consistency which holds fast to good judgment. How are these things reached? If all of truth has been seen, if orderliness, moderation, and seemliness are preserved in actions, and a will which is guiltless and kindly, focused upon reason and never departing from it, as lovable as it is admirable. To put it in a nutshell for you, the wise man's mind should be such as befits God."
Yeah, great. Let's just jump into that breakdown of those different subtypes. Um, I always love how that really kind of solidifies this idea for us. But it was absolutely the case that they thought about these sub areas, and that was a tradition in Stoicism. It's the same thing across the other virtues, same thing we looked at for courage, and it really helps put some kind of meat on the bones of this idea.
Yeah, absolutely. So the line again, to just revisit it, is moderation. What are those four parts from Aristodemus? Good discipline, seemliness, modesty, and self-control. It's also, that line is also translated as to self-restraint are subordinated orderliness, propriety, modesty, and self-control. And we'll get into these four parts as we go. So that first one, good discipline or orderliness, I could be said as entaxia or eutaxia, which those mean in order or good order. I think that this can be captured as the knowledge of when something must be done and in what sequence and overall of the order of actions. So you can think of this almost as a kind of discipline. I suppose two things front to mind: knowing what the right action is in a given situation, and then having the skill to fulfill that action or the actions that are required of you in a competent way. So that's that first part, orderliness.
Yeah, I always like to think about these in terms of the opposite too. Like, what would it look like with somebody that lacks orderliness or lacks good discipline? Well, you see that all the time. People will walk into a martial arts club and they go, "Well, I want to be world champion." You go, "Well, you've kind of got the, I mean, it's fine as a concept, but you've kind of got the order of events there mixed up. You've got to, first you got to train for 10 years and then maybe you'll go pro." And you see that with kids, like, "Oh, I want to write a book or I want to make a movie." And it's like, well, okay, what are the actions that make you the kind of person that can do this, that can be this kind of person? And do you have the orderliness, the good discipline to pursue those actions in order? Or do you try to jump to the end and you find yourself frustrated?
Mhm.
I think it's a great lesson.
Yeah, and I think it brings out why I think it's right to see these people who are dedicated to their craft as moderate. You mentioned Stephen King and
Mm-hmm.
Murakami earlier, because they exemplify this good discipline, this orderliness in their day to day. by, setting aside, those 6 hours in the beginning of the day just to write, to focus on their craft without distractions, what have you. And I think you can see that in people who have a, different pattern of life as well, where they're don't have that same focus on a specific craft, but maybe they're the manager or CEO type where they have tons of things they're juggling, but they're able to do that in a skillful way without overlooking their health, their relationships outside of their career, and so on.
Hmm.
And I think it also brings to mind how close the Stoic virtues are to skill, and it's about cultivating abilities, not so much, it's easy to think of virtue as something that's purely moral in a modern sense, where you're following rules, aiming to be a good person. But you also have these ideas of skill, building up your capacity to do things, cultivating yourself, your mind to be excellent in your craft, your relationships, and so on.
Yeah, I love that. Like this idea that you can lack excellence without being immoral in a colloquial sense. So you can be a very nice person who's very kind, gentle, but you don't have your life in order. When you set out to make plans, you don't go about the right order of things. And so that's colloquially we would say, well, they're not a bad person. But the Stoic question is that question, as you said, of like, are you an excellent person? Would an excellent person be able to do this? Yes. Well, then there's an issue with your excellence. And that kind of excellence for them is I think it's like tightly connected with the moral. And we don't even need to go like obviously there's like robust Stoic theory that supports that, but
Sure,
the
sure.
idea is just that like at the end of the day, you're not going to be able to do the moral things well if you don't have these things that colloquially today don't seem to be about morality. If you're not the kind of person that is has discipline, there's a lot of great things, morally great things that we would consider today that can only be done with a lot of discipline. So there's a connection there, but the Stoics would have seen those as being much tighter or different sides of the same puzzle or piece, as opposed to today where we kind of, most of us separate them if you're non-Stoic.
Right, right. Yep. Yeah, absolutely. Cool. So that's orderliness. Our second aspect is propriety or seemliness. Propriety is the knowledge of suitable and unsuitable motions. That's from the Epitome of Stoic Ethics. And motions here mean impulses. So I'll read another section that makes this clear. They say that what sets impulse moving is nothing other than a spontaneously impulsive impression of what is appropriate, while in genus, impulse is a motion of the soul toward something. So that's that movement towards something. I suppose you can think of it as, what comes before that. You decide to pick up a glass. That motion is that internal decision, that internal impulse, and then the rest of that movement is, depending on the control of your body and the external world, fulfilled by you reaching and grabbing the glass, and so on. So propriety is the knowledge of what impulses are suitable, unsuitable, what decisions are ideal or not. And again, you can think of this perhaps as seemliness or maybe even fittingness. What is fitting for the situation, what is appropriate for the situation. And this has to do with that Stoic idea of role ethics. What's happening in the present, and then what roles do you serve in the present is what this aspect of moderation is all about. So perhaps one example of this could be if you're on a special diet, but you happen to be visiting your grandparents who make this special dish that violates whatever diet you're on, and might be exceptionally offended if you don't have that dish. Then would it be more moderate to stick with your diet, or would it be more moderate to break that discipline, that restraint on what you're eating, and instead play that role of, being a good grandchild or what have you. And I think, there are going to be different cases for this one, but I think, some cases it's clear that the more moderate action is not staying disciplined with respect to your diet, but doing the appropriate thing and, eating that dish as a sign of respect or appreciation of your grandparents.
Yeah, again, I like the grandparent example because again, I think when I think of all these, I think of like, oh, a teenager doesn't have these. Like when I think of the opposite, I think, oh, just the teenager. And so there's this aspect of being a teenager where you become incredibly this time period where you become incredibly kind of moralistic and like absolute and like you imagine the example of somebody who, and not to say I disagree with this position, but somebody who's discovered vegetarianism or veganism, and it's not only like I'm not going to eat this meat, but like I refuse to be at this family dinner if you're cooking meat or serving it here, and you could point to that person and being like, okay, well you maybe because there's less adults that do that. And one answer you could give is that, well, adults are actually losing something. Teenagers are better and the world breaks us down. And now as I get older, I'm moving further away from that idea that teenagers had it figured out. And I'm moving more towards the idea, well, there's some subtlety here. And some people, some people aren't true to themselves. And some people give up on what they believe in. But other people, you got to choose, you got to pick and choose your battles. You've got to be sensitive to the context that of what's appropriate in the context you're in. And so that kind of propriety, I think, is something you pick up as you get older. The other things, I think that's like the grand parent dinner example is great, or the
Mhm.
Thanksgiving dinner where people are saying things you don't agree with and trying to balance that appropriately. The other thing this makes me think of, like, we're going to get into some philosophy of emotions here, but I talk a lot in a simplified form is saying that emotions are caused by value judgments, which is to say when you think something's bad, you feel a negative emotion. If I think something is going to kill me and that's bad, I'm going to be afraid. If I think something's going to be good for me, I'm going to be happy. But the Stoics also talk about, and Margaret Graver talks about this in Stoicism and Emotion. The Stoics also talk about how there's two things. There's the value judgment, but there's also the judgment that it is appropriate to emote in this situation, that it's appropriate to feel the emotion. So there's both that, like, if someone passes, there's both the value that's bad that they've passed, and it's appropriate for me to cry. It's appropriate for me to grieve externally.
Mhm.
And so you can attack the value judgment, but you can also attack that view on appropriateness. And so different cultures will respond to grief differently. And one thing you'd say is well, most cultures think that dying is a bad thing, but they might have different judgments about the appropriate way to show that, or kind of the appropriate way, not just to show it, but to actually to kind of to feel it and do you lean into it? Do you let it take over you, or do you kind of like hold back and attempt to restrain it? And so I think what's being referred to here about, like, the knowledge of what motions are suitable and unsuitable, I don't think it can't be that whole view of, what is the right thing to value or not value, because it can't be about value judgments, because that's just way too large of a category to be a subcategory of moderation. Maybe it is, but I think that's a pretty big category, right? Because courage is also about knowing what's worth being afraid of and what's not being worth afraid of. And that's also just what's a suitable motion to run away and what's an unsuitable motion,
Mhm.
to stand your ground, for example, or something like this. Um, so I think there's also this connection here, the idea of not just, okay, now that you're feeling the motion, now that you're feeling the feeling, is it suitable or not? Is it appropriate or not? And do you lean into it, or do you try to hold back?
Yeah, I think what makes it distinct is that social aspect to it, which
Mm-hmm.
is what, questions about how do I express myself bring to mind, because you're expressing, of course, and usually in the presence of others and communicating something. And I think propriety, that's one way in which I think propriety is probably a useful translation, because it has to do with what's proper in a given community, society, and so on. So that's when you're bringing into mind these judgments about roles, culture, that can be relative in a certain sense. Of course, not completely. It's not subjective. There is a right answer, but there's no universal rules
Hmm.
because you do have those differences in circumstance, society, and culture, and so on.
Yeah, great
Cool.
point.
All right, sweet. We got two more to go through. So we have orderliness, propriety, and then modesty. So modesty is a knowledge which is able to avoid correct reproach. So you can think of it as a kind of self respect, or um, that ability to act in an honorable way so that people who are also virtuous might not say, you're acting a little bit too big for your britches. You don't want to be self-aggrandizing, and you want to avoid proper criticism that you might get from someone who you respect for being self-aggrandizing. But you're also not being called to show any sense of false humility. I think modesty for the Stoics represents, a knowledge that's related to a kind of self-respect about how good you are in a given situation. And it's not hubris, excessive pride, but it's also not a false humility. If you are really good at a given thing, being modest in this sense doesn't, calls you not to aggrandize yourself or be becoming about it, but it also doesn't call you to, cultivate any sense of what might be called false humility or something of that sort.
So this is about self knowledge. Is that it? Like not understanding what you are, and then not acting in a way that is above that or below that.
Yeah, so I'll read from a commentary that explains this a little bit, explains this or adds some detail to this. So, the third species of moderation, Chrysippus lists, is the sense of honor, ademosine, which is what we're using for modesty. This comes close to the Aristotelian and wider Greek notion of eidos. But eidos is a feeling of shame, not a virtue. The sense of honor, as against the feeling of shame, is preventative. It is a sense of what ought to be done and of the honor in doing the right thing and the dishonor of not doing it, given that virtue is the only good. So I think it is a knowledge, a kind of self knowledge, but also having the self respect, I suppose, to act in a noble, honorable way that, and here again, we see the social aspect that wouldn't be up for criticism from others, or perhaps if you want to get into some lines from Epictetus, wouldn't be up for criticism from your own self-image. And that's how it's linked to the sense of honor, both internal and external.
Okay, so I mean, maybe correct me if I'm getting this wrong, but one way that I would think about this, I would think, okay, what does it look like to think that? It's to think this is beneath me, or this is not appropriate of me. And now, like when somebody asks you to do something stupid or bad, or like why don't you go and insult that person? And you think, well, that's beneath me. That's not appropriate. And in that way, it's a kind of a preventative recognition of your own honor that's preventative from you doing something shameful. Is that something like this?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's good. Another example of this is sometimes people have an image of that coach or perhaps their parents who, maybe they're thinking about binging on something and then they imagine their coach and their parents, critiquing them for doing that. And and I think the healthiest versions of this that prevents them from binging and, turns their attention back to something more worthwhile.
Yeah. So if eidos is the shame, if that is like the I'm not mad, I'm disappointed of the coach, then modesty is like acting that out yourself before it gets to that point, right? Like an acting and internalizing that and having that as a part of you. I'm trying to think of the opposite example, and I think of the person who has no modesty. Again, it would be I think the end of a teenager, right? And the teenager's asked to do something silly, peer pressured into doing something, and they're like, "Sure, whatever, I'll do it." I'm not afraid of anything. And it's like, well, maybe there's nothing to be afraid of there, but maybe you're kind of crossing a line. You're doing something that's beneath you by acting like there's no value, acting like it doesn't matter if you're careless with your actions.
Yeah. That's a good example. Yeah, I suppose you have the example of doing something that's beneath you, maybe shooting too high, and that's where that self knowledge comes in.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Doing something that isn't a real sense above you that you shouldn't be doing. Another example that comes to mind is I think a lot of healthy and competent working cultures have an idea of no task as long as it pushes the team forward is beneath you, which is
Mm-hmm.
another way I think of capturing modesty, where even if you're in a higher up position and you see something lower level that's gone wrong, or something in the details, like some customer service ticket needs to be handled or something like this, like you do it, or you move it instead of thinking about, oh, I'm a higher level now, I don't need to be managing like these small tiny details and so on. So I think that's another maybe a way you see a kind of modesty in organizations.
Yeah, that would be being, if you passing that up would be immodest by being too high in your
Yeah,
horse,
exactly.
as opposed to
Yep.
immodest about not taking yourself seriously.
Cool. All right, so our last one, self-control. Self-control is a knowledge that does not overstep the bounds of what has come to light in accord with the correct reasoning. Another interpretation of this from Diogenes Laertius is the state which is invincible cannot be lessened by pleasures. And to me, this is, I think, that part of moderation, which is that character trait to recognize that something is the right thing and that you should do something. That's sort of the, that reason shining its light, and then acting on it. That's how I think about it. It's avoiding weakness of will. Of course, the
Yeah.
Stoics don't, strictly speaking, believe in weakness of will, but it's avoiding that kind of thing. Having the self control to recognize, this is the correct action, correct response, and then acting accordingly. And that's why I think Diogenes Laertius, his explanation is really nice. You're invincible in a sense. You recognize something ought to be done, and it doesn't matter what temptations you're facing to avoid it, whether that comes from uh, wanting to do something more pleasurable or from avoiding pain, what have you.
Yeah, I think that was really well put. I think that's right. It's the idea to be motivated by what reason, the right thing to do. But I again, trying to pull up these counter examples, when Aristotle talks a lot about self control in the Nicomachean Ethics and talks about weakness of will, this is enkratia, which is to be, kratos is power, so it's like having power, in power,
Mm-hmm.
where akrasia is lacking power. And so Aristotle talks about how people that have weakness of will are actually comparatively not that bad of people, because they at least identify the right thing and want to do the right thing. They're just kind of weak. They're being overpowered. And so you think of somebody who is like this, who's in self control, which is to say, well, when they set a plan for themselves, they can't be overpowered. Nothing will knock them off that plan. No amount of pleasure, presumably the opposite of pain, they set a goal and they will continue towards it. Now, this is why the Stoics talk about all the virtues being interentailing, right? Because any of these ones we just talked about, you could have and still be a bad person. Like you could have self control and be a bad person if reason reveals to you the wrong kinds of things, I guess, or if you set bad plans. But it's just that, as you said, it's that idea of not being knocked off. I mean, I guess the Stoic definition here is don't overstep the bounds of what has come to light in accordance with correct reason. So maybe the Stoics are building that in a bit.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that's the way I like to think about that. Is you just like you don't fail to achieve the plans you set about.
Right. Nice. So those are our four aspects. We have orderliness, propriety, modesty, self-control. Something I like about these is, if you're thinking about how do I improve in moderation, I think a lot of the obvious examples that might come to mind is, maybe removing something, some place where I'm acting in an immoderate way, where I'm not acting with self restraint. And that's always one legitimate strategy. But I think these subcomponents bring to mind other ideas. Where can you improve orderliness? Are there some places where I'm not understanding what needs to be done and the right sequence, what's the actual plan for making that happen? Or propriety, am I being moderate in the right situations? Thinking about this maybe from more of a social aspect. Am I fulfilling my role in a way that displays this virtue of moderation, self-control, and such? And then modesty, recognizing what's truly beneath oneself, avoiding that while not, aggrandizing yourself and making mistaken judgments on that front. And then finally, this self-control, where are places where you recognize what needs to be done but aren't following through, and how can you tweak that? So I think those going through these subcomponents is useful for thinking about different ideas to actually become more moderate. And anyway, that's how I think about it. And I hope y'all are able to take away some ideas on that front as well.
Yeah, I think it's incredibly helpful. I also hear this list and I go, oh boy, you definitely want to invite some Stoics to your next party. There's some wild people. But that's just the joke I'm making. I think these are the really are the building blocks of like a good life. And I mean, everything you said, I think was bang on, Caleb. And it just also just gives us positive things, right? Like so often we think of self-control of like, damn it, I broke my diet. I'm ashamed of myself, or I'm angry with myself, or I was lazy. And just think of it as like building a positive skill, right? Like, do you put the first things first? Do you recognize what modesty looks like in this situation, or do you have self-respect that's able to motivate you? These kinds of like positive goals to aim at is a nice alternative to the shame. I find moderation often gets talked about like you're either moderate or you're like shameful. You're either like achieving it or you're bad. And this is like, okay, well, now we have this kind of positive model to build and to grow and develop towards, which for me is a much better conception of self-development.
Yep, absolutely. Awesome.
Thanks, Gil.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks for listening to Stoic Conversations. Please give us a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify and share it with a friend. If you want to dive deeper still, search Stoa in the App Store or Play Store for a complete app with routines, meditations, and lessons designed to help people become more stoic. And I'd also like to thank Michael Levy for graciously letting us use his music. You can find more of his work at ancientlyre.com. And finally, please get in touch with us. Send a message to stoa@stoameditation.com if you ever have any feedback, questions, or recommendations. Until next time.